Welcome to the Innovative Leader Podcast, featuring Christy Geiger, Executive Coach with Synergy Strategies, and David Phillips, Professor, Consultant, and Coach. Well, we're back with another episode of the Innovative Leader, and Christy and I are here. Today we're going to talk about Leadership 2.0 versus Leadership 4.0 and how they function in terms of processes, in terms of communication, and in terms of decision making. And so we've been bantering around Leadership 2.0 versus Leadership 4.0 for weeks now about how we're going to describe this and how we're going to approach this. And so this will be kind of our first foray into that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about how leaders interact in terms of communication, decision making, and then putting processes together. So Christy, it's good to see you again, and hope you're doing well. And so tell me what you think when you think Leadership 2.0. I think this is a good place to start.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited to talk about it too, because I think on one hand, the concept has been around for a while, but when we flipped into 2020, it begins to take more and more shape. So the way that I've noticed it is 2.0, to me, when I'm thinking about that with my clients or we're talking about it, 2.0 tends to represent more a traditional era. And it was an era, more the industrial era when there was kind of a top-down leadership. We were moving into greater production. It was about quality and efficiency and things like that. And so it was really this era of growing management, and management was leadership. And you worked your way up the ladder. And the way that you led was through this more hierarchical approach of leadership. And people who were on the bottom were more really like minions. You're the worker bees, and you just needed to do what you were told to do. You didn't need to think. And as a matter of fact, if you thought, you probably were not doing your job. So stop thinking and just do your job a little bit. And some people might push back on that, but ultimately it comes down to that, because if you have a question or if you push back on leadership a little bit, that really wasn't as welcome, because we can't have 10 cooks in the kitchen. We just need to have that, head, and in order to lead the charge, and then the army needs to follow, so to speak. And obviously, I like to say with our millennial era that's come up, and sometimes people can be very critical of millennials and misunderstanding of their intentions and the way they show up. But I believe the millennial era really just shows up in a way that is very transparently reflectant of our culture today, which is more in the 4.0, this digital era, how technology and the digital times have really changed the way we think and operate, a lot coming out of the Silicon Valley, whatever, but it changes and has created this 4.0 era. And the 4.0 era is quite different in the language we use, in the approach we take, even though I would say even in the 90s, we started talking about flat organizations, and we started talking about the experienced economy, which sometimes is resonant with 4.0. 4.0 is still different, is very flat, more team-oriented, more empowering. The leader isn't to be the boss, but the leader is to be the supporter, the coach, the champion, to bring out the brilliance of the team players, because the team has the answer. So it really flips it upside down. And I think today leaders are in this place where we're used to being 2.0 leaders. We're trying to be progressive and contemporary 4.0 leaders, but we don't always know what it looks like or how to do it. And frankly, sometimes it feels like a lot of work, and it feels like people going every which direction and chaos, and we feel a little out of control. So it can be challenging to be 4.0, but that's how I kind of experience it, just with my leaders, with clients, and that tension of this change that we're moving into that we must embrace, because 2.0 is becoming unacceptable. People don't want to work in a 2.0 framework.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with all that. I think we see 2.0 arising a lot out of the industrialization that happened probably in the earliest 20th century. Some of those early 1900s, mid 1900s. I think of organizations like GE, and I think of Ford, those kinds of things where it was very automated, and you had a role, and you didn't change that role. You didn't try to expand that role. You had a role, and you did what you were told to do. And then on the 4.0 side, from a and of course I kind of come at that from a little bit more of an academic structure, but even from a software perspective as well. But I see that as really arising from this move toward agile software development that arose in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and that the DNA of that agile methodology that was developed over that weekend, it has permeated Silicon Valley, and as a result, that mindset is what we live and function in, and then you wrap millennials or digitals who have grown up with that, and they are all over that kind of leadership, and so we need to obviously adapt, and we need to think through how we lead in challenging times. We need to approach that, because millennials encompass more than half, maybe even 2/3 or 3/4 of the working population now. The rise of the millennial generation is huge. Their workforce is huge, and to move that generation forward and typical ideas of productivity and development and entrepreneurship, things like that, then they have to be led and coached as opposed to told, because they will fight and push back against being told. Part of that's just the way they were raised by their parents, and part of that's culture as well. So
yeah, I like that. I think there's a way too that it results in, I think sometimes, even though this isn't invisible, it feels very invisible, because it's kind of an experience, and people will have this experience that they have a hard time articulating. They just know they don't like it. And they may feel a loss of freedom. They may feel suffocated. They may feel stuck or unable to get traction. And so they have this sense of frustration, which then results, I think, like you were saying, in this type of rebellion, or it seems like this pouty 2-year-old, oh, I'm not going to do that. They're not using my strengths. Like it seems like this very immature rebellion, but really I think that's just how it manifests when it's like, I feel frustrated. I have these strengths I want to contribute. I thought there was an opportunity to do that here, and I'm in a shoebox, and I'm not okay with that.
Right. And and I will say, I'm 50, so I'm obviously not a millennial, but there are times. But I've grown up with, Atari and computers and things since I was a kid, so I feel like I've kind of grown up as a digital. But there are times when I have people try to tell me what to do, and because of how they say it, or because of what I know about them, I just reject it, because of what I know about them. That they didn't approach me in a way that demonstrated that they were interested in anything I had to say, or any of my past work, or any of my abilities, and they just told me to do something, and I will push back. I'll push back on that. So it's not just. I don't think it's necessarily that age group. I think it has a lot to do with, in addition to a culture, just knowing who I am and knowing how leadership functions and should function. I don't like it either. So I'll throw my hat in there.
No, I agree. Right. And I think that's kind of this misunderstanding that we put these millennials or whatever in a bucket. And I believe we all are operating. That's why, to me, it's a cultural shift. It's not just, oh, for you to work well with millennials.
Right.
No. Everybody, you could be 80 and feel that way. 80-year-olds have the same mistrust of government, the same mistrust of leadership, the same, listen to my voice.
Right.
They have the same cries that the millennial has, because it's a cultural shift. And I think it also comes from all sorts of things. I mean, I think women look at that 50, 100 years ago versus today, all of our voices. And even when we look at just the computer shift of, you went to the library to get information versus the internet was born, and now I could get information at 11 o'clock at night if I wanted to. And then social media and email, or whatever, email and then social media was born. It allows more individual voice. And even the shift into publishing and how easy it is to self-publish and whatnot, where people are able to grow their competency and their expertise,
Right.
and they are invited and free to speak. And the more people have that, they have competency and they have thoughts and ideas, they want to share them. They're not the, dumb corncob person. And I'm not saying that I'm just saying nobody is this backdoor person that doesn't know anything. Everybody sees themselves as a valuable contributor. And so it becomes unacceptable to treat anybody in that kind of marginalized minion position.
Right.
Whereas 100 years ago, some people just felt like they didn't know. They didn't feel like they had that competency or stature. And so society said, be quiet. And so they did. And that's really changed. And so it becomes unacceptable.
It sure does. Let's get into how a 2.0 leader versus a 4.0 leader would think about processes and systems. We were talking earlier, the 2.0 leader is basically going to define the process and define the system, and then have the minions execute on it. A 4.0 leader is going to create that environment where people can create the processes and fix the processes. It's a self-organization, this self-correction that goes on. And I think that's a huge shift and a huge change, because it reduces the power or the control. That's a better word. The control of a 2.0 leader, and that can become scary and just really become scary for them. How would you express that?
Yeah, I like that. It makes me think about with COVID-19 and what's happening and this workforce moving to work at home. And so when we think about that process and what you were just describing, how does a leader or a company who is more 2.0 oriented, and again, sometimes we don't even realize how 2.0 we are until you kind of start to put yourself through the filter and you go, do I feel worried that people are doing work when they're at home? Am I thinking about instituting a computer time clock to make sure people are working from 9 to 5? Do I feel like I need people to send a to-do list at the top of the day and the end of the day with a checklist so I know what they got done? You might be a little bit 2.0.
Right.
Yeah, so I get it. I'm kind of a control freak sometimes, a lot of times. So I understand this delicate balance of productivity and production and the need to move business forward. But how does that look? What does a 4.0 at-home company look like? How would you describe that?
Yeah, so it's interesting as you said that. We almost in so many organizations expect their employees to come home and do work at night at home. So they expect that and they entrust that to them, but they can't trust that to them during the day. I just, that just kind of popped in my head. So from a 4.0, so I have the luxury of working at home. And I don't know that it's necessarily a 4.0 organization, but I do have that luxury just because of my role. And it is, you really, so from a leadership standpoint, you have to entrust your people, and you have to, so that goes to hiring the right people. You have to you have to have people in your organization that you trust. So it puts probably a little bit more pressure on the leadership in the hiring process, because you're not there. You can't see what they do. But that's part of it. And then you essentially tell them, and this is essentially what I was told, get your job done when it needs to be done. That's it. So it's not, now I worked for a 2.0 organization in a previous position, and it was all about making sure you were there the right number of hours. It wasn't necessarily what you got done. It was the fact that you fulfilled your hourly obligation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a huge, to me, that's just demonstrative of the two different mindsets. One said, just get it done, do your job and get it done. And I trust you to do that. And I'm going to give you the tools to do that. And we're going to have conversations every week or every couple of weeks. We're going to have team meetings every week or every couple of weeks. I can tell what you're doing by the reaction I get from these groups of people. If you have a case that's elevated above me straight through to another source, then I know you haven't been doing your job. So there's all kinds of indicators within the organization as to how effective and how productive you are. And from a leadership standpoint, you just got to trust your people, and you got to empower them and give them the tools that they need. And that requires a very hands-off approach, which again is a huge shift.
Yeah, I think there's this fear that if you have this hands-off approach, that results go out the window.
Yeah.
And I believe that's a misconception, because it's how we go about getting those results is different. And in that 2.0, it's very hierarchical. I tell you what to do. Here's how to do your job. These are the requirements and the expectations, and right. You need to conform and adhere to those. And I need to be watching you to make sure you're doing that. And even though sometimes we think, oh, I'm the nice manager, I do it in a fun way. You can still be 2.0 and fun and still doing that. Or you could be a bad leader and, oh, well, I'm supposed to tell you this, but whatever you do is great. Okay, that's a bad 2.0 leader. It's still the same thing. But I think, it is true about hiring and hiring people that fit your culture and fit that paradigm, because they're going to be more naturally motivated, versus if you hire someone who's not in alignment with that value system, it's much more difficult to get them kind of in that same flow.
Right.
I also think it reminded me a lot of teaching children. And that you can really strong arm a child into the way they should go, or you can train and mentor them in the way they should go. Mm-hmm. And to me, this just really tips to that model where you're coaching and training and mentoring. So if I say, clean your room, at the end of the day, I expect a clean room. Now, here's your cleaning tools, and here's a book on how to clean, and I'll check back at 6 o'clock and it needs to be done. And we're kind of exaggerating more to the 2.0 right. to make it very black and white. But versus the 4.0 is, have you cleaned your room before? What are your ideas about how you might clean your room? What does a clean room look like to you? Well, that's interesting. That's great. Here's what a clean room looks like to me. Can we agree that making your bed, why would that contribute to a room looking clean or not? Right. So you're having this conversation instead of just telling and dictating. And so it's really this mentoring. And a word that I love in this side is designed accountability, because sometimes people feel like in 4.0 results are out the window, there's no control, it's total anarchy, people just do as they see fit, and all chaos is going to break out, and how are we ever going to achieve goals and objectives?
Right.
Well, no, designed accountability is like, great, well, how long do you think it's going to take you to clean your room? And what would support you to clean your room? Okay, great. So you think you'd like to have it done by noon, and we're agreeing that making your bed, picking up your floor, and putting all your toys away is what clean looks like.
Right.
Okay, great. That sounds good. Do you need any help from me? Is there a way that I can support you? All right, perfect. So I'll check back at noon and we'll go from there. Great. That's designed accountability. We've talked through what it looks like. We've talked about what it looks like, not how to do your job. We're not managing how you do your job.
Right.
We're simply creating the framework or a structure for people to be empowered to do it their way. You know, the 10 different ways to cut a watermelon kind of a concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, and it's I go back to a 2.0 leader I had not too long ago as well, and around the office, everybody knew that if it wasn't their idea, it didn't get done.
Mm.
And to me, that's another example of a 2.0 leader, especially in times of process and figuring out how to, you know, what to do, how to do, because, and that was extremely frustrating for me because I'm an idea person. So coming up with ideas and say, hey, we could try this, we could try this, we could try this. And you get constantly told, no, it's actually, it's devaluing and it's very frustrating. And everybody, you know, everybody knew it. So the trick was to try to figure out how to make it their idea. Right. So now it becomes a game. It becomes a game in how to get how to manipulate them so that you can do what you think needs to be done.
Yeah, right. I like to say positive manipulation, not manipulation to hurt anyone, but in the betterment of the whole. So that brings up a really good point, though, and kind of moves us to decisions too, but bridges the two, is when everybody has ideas, if you want to be team and collaborative and respectful of people's ideas, and then you maybe you have a lot of idea generators on your team, how do you go about making decisions? How do you keep things moving forward without suddenly, you know, you're selling Italian and Mexican and Chinese food out of the same shop because everyone's got a brilliant idea? Like, how do you make decisions and not really have that anarchy where everybody's doing as they see fit and everyone has their flavor of the day idea? Doesn't things just go crazy? I mean, I don't believe it does, but how do you think you navigate that, and how do you make decisions to keep things moving in a direction but yet respectful of all the ideas?
Yeah, so I think that goes back to you know, in our last podcast we were talking about organizational change, and we spent a lot of time talking about identity. And so I think it really goes back to that. Who are you? You know, and you know, I don't want this to sound in any way racially racial, but let's go back to the food, the you know, the restaurant situation. If you grew up, you're Hispanic, and all you know is Hispanic food, you don't open a Chinese restaurant, you know, unless you know that culture, unless you know how to cook it, unless you've been around, you know. So you don't you stay in line or in tune with who you are as a person, as an organization, and then you build on that. You try to shape the ideas, sort of say ideology, but shape the ideas around that so that it expands the organization and builds the organization, but you don't lose who you are as an organization. Does that make sense? I lost your audio.
Sorry, we have
Okay.
papers outside, so I muted. Thank you. I think that's great. I totally think that makes sense. And I think that goes back to your point about hiring too. And whether it's hiring or simply training people what those organizational values are. And I think in the 2.0 world, sometimes there is confusion, you know, remember, and sometimes it's really in that 3.0 transition stage, but where it was like, what's your mission statement and your vision and your values, and post them on the wall so everybody knows. I think sometimes leaders didn't really know how to use that. And so they posted them, but they never referenced them.
Right.
Or they were there, but they weren't really a measuring point of our success or if we were doing it or not. They just were this like guide point for how we should operate if it's convenient or if it works out. But I think when you're making decisions according to those values and you're teaching your team What are our values? How do we make decisions? They actually learn to vet their own ideas.
Right.
So how does that idea match our values? How does that idea match our vision and our mission? Does this idea help us to dig into our mission more? Does this move us forward in our vision? Or does it take us away from our vision? What's possible here?
Right.
And then they begin to vet it, which will help them to come up with even more quality ideas, that you don't just have to be the no person. No, not that, not that, not that. But you're teaching them, coaching them, mentoring them on what does a great idea look like? How do we vet out a great idea? I'm not the only person vetting the idea. We're going to vet it together,
right,
because we want to know, is it a good idea or not? I don't know. Let's think it through.
Yeah, in fact, I had to go back to the first part of that, what you were saying, I had an organizational leadership professor say that he asked this question in class. We were sitting around the table, and he said, who do you think had an amazing mission statement and core values? And people kind of were quiet. And he said, Enron. That was plastered all over their wall. That when you looked at it, it was right down the line of what they would expect to have a mission, have for mission and have for core values and have for those kinds of things. And yet nobody acted on it. And so just to have that is not effective, but to create that culture where people live around that is what's necessary. And that culture can kind of create the guardrails from which we do innovation and from which we ideate. And
yeah,
I just made that word up, I'm sure, but
no, ideate is a great word. I'm going to close this window.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I agree. Innovation and ideation both come from that, and you're still using those filters. That is interesting about Enron. And, I think sometimes not that you were being whatever, I just feel like I always like to go for the underdog, that we all are guilty of having the placard up there and not living by it, or that we've developed it and it's been a year since you looked at it or whatever, right? Which is why you have those systems in place. Pull out the values, integrate that into your level 10 meeting or your regular meeting. Like, how are you keeping those in front of you? Because it's really easy to forget about them. I think we're all subject to that.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think from a language standpoint, and this just may be semantics, but identity works better for me, because you're starting to talk about, this is who I am, this is who we are at our core, as opposed to talk about mission, because I think at some point some of that language becomes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah,
we have to reframe how we approach from a language standpoint.
I like that. And it reminds me a bit of, a lot of times we'll say that 2.0 is more transactional versus 4.0 is more dynamic. And I think sometimes a mission and vision can become more transactional. Not that it was ever intended to be.
Right.
It was intended to be very dynamic. It was intending to be a flashlight, to be a compass and a guide. But on some level, it can become very transactional, versus something more organic and dynamic allows us to keep assessing every day. How am I doing that? Am I showing up the way that I intend to show up? Is this who I am? Or is this someone who I am not, even who I am as an organization or whatever? So very dynamic. I actually love that concept of just saying your identity versus your mission and your vision. That's great.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just, language to me, that's important. I think of, I was reading a book years ago, and it talked about what some of the way the words have changed in our culture, and one of the expressions was, do you know what the word overwhelm means, where it came from? And it was a sailing term, that referred to a wave that came over the helm of a boat.
Mm.
And so now we actually join those two words together, overwhelm. And now it talks about the stress that we're overwhelmed with stress, or we're overwhelmed with work, or we're overwhelmed. Even the word broadcast, you think the original meaning of the word broadcast was of a farmer who went out and took the seed and just threw it on the ground, right? So now you have all these definitions of broadcast. You have broadcast like a TV. You have that kind of original meaning that exists in some cultures. So when we start to look at language and how we relate to that language, that to me, identity is so much more of in tune with who we're, because people are trying to figure out who they are. So it makes,
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think your language point is huge, because I think in a 2.0 world, sometimes people are very critical of language. They're like, oh, you're just saying a different word. It's the same thing. And they get very critical and feel like you're changing a word just to make people feel better, that you're accommodating people to make them feel better. And that's not really what it's about. The reality is that words create emotions, which create a lockdown subconscious experience in our body. And so if we have a certain relationship to a word, that has gone into our limbic system, which goes into our subconscious of the way that we experience or process something.
Right.
So that's part of the reason why 2.0 can feel a certain way versus 4.0 can feel a certain way. Those words that are used can create a 2.0 sensation or feeling, versus like using the word identity or collaboration or whatever can be more 4.0 words. I think it's a great exercise to just take words and study it and be like, to me, designed accountability is more 4.0 than straight accountability or results and measurables or whatever. Not that you're moving away from that, but it's just designed accountability. What are your 4.0 words versus what are your 2.0 words, and how do you feel? They make you feel in the box. It's probably a 2.0 word. 4.0 feels like it has expansive potential. It's more growth minded. But I love your point about language.
Yeah, and it's more relational than I think a 2.0 framework is. It's you start talking about identity. Well, that's core to who we are as a person. So that's obviously more of a relational word, and it creates some room in that organization, so that you can be who you are within the heart and core of be who you are as a person within the heart and core of the organization. It shows flexibility within it, for the uniqueness that is you, and people are drawn to that kind of organization because, I mean, there's this great move, this uprising within culture for people being able to express their uniqueness in their own personal identity. And when you use 4.0 language, it is language that draws people to you as opposed to that transactional language. So it brings people who would want to work for you, or who may be stars and want to work with you. It brings them to your door.
Yes. It's a great point, relational versus task, and how you're seeing people. Are you seeing them as a task executor? Or are you seeing them as a human being versus a human doing?
Yep, exactly.
I think that also kind of goes to decision making too, that the 2.0 decision making is really, what do we need to do? What is the task that needs to be executed? What are the orders? What are the results that we need? And we're really just driving the task.
Right.
And humans really are human doings. And because that's gotten so escalated and so elevated, I think that's where people have gone, wow, the world keeps going faster and faster. We're going to implode. Yeah, because if you keep going faster and faster like that, you are going to implode. And so this really becomes a shift where you look at this human being in front of you and you're evaluating the task. You're looking at the results together. You're looking at potential rather than compliance, like what's possible. How could we do this? What's another way of doing this versus just do it? How do you get this done in a compliance manner? Like there's a way that you're looking at things through the filter and the lens of the human being versus the task of that human doing, I think is a huge shift in how you make a decision and how you assess something.
Yeah, and I just think back to, of course, I'm a huge history buff, and so I end up watching, when I can't sleep, I'll watch History Channel, or I'll watch something, a documentary or something, and I look at how the West was won. I'm not talking about 1830s. I'm talking about the rise of the railroads, the rise of all the work that was done in mining and things like that. And I look at the conditions that those people were in, and I think, my goodness, could I have worked and functioned in something like that, and B, what would be in my heart to put people in conditions like that in some cases. And but you had, the Vanderbilts and the JP Morgans and all those people who really helped industrialize the U.S., and they were running those organizations. And not to demean them in any way, it's just the mindset that's different. They were cogs in a wheel to ultimately to achieve the task at hand, as opposed to, like you said, human beings who have feelings and emotions, who have families, who have health concerns, who have life concerns. You've got kids who are crazy or sick or struggling in school. All those things, and the weight that brings on an individual, and then you're asking them to simply be a cog and to do what you tell them to do. The heart that it would take to have that mindset is, I don't know if I could. I can't comprehend me having that. And so but then to make the decision to put people in those situations where they're going to be overwhelmed just with the job, and just dismiss what's going on in life and really have no compassion for that, is I don't see how those decisions work.
I think it was kind of a different era. I feel like the value shifts have changed too, which contributes to this. Is at that season or in that snapshot of time, it was survival.
Yeah.
And so the higher trumping value was survival. And so if I could go work in a mine and I could earn $4 an hour or whatever, maybe it was like $2 an hour versus 10 cents, picking crops or whatever. I'm not good with history.
Yeah.
but I know that there was a higher value on a more risky job, right? But it was about survival. And so that value is survival and providing, and just where things were created a different value system of what I was willing to do. And I don't think at that point it felt so oppressive. It felt like an opportunity, because at that point it was an opportunity, because it gave me an opportunity for greater survival. But today the game and the stakes have changed. And so the need to have one's voice known, look at all the, podcasts and whatnot, is people want to express their voice. They want to have that freedom and independence. So we're just in a different era that creates a different dynamic that we have to respond to. So real quick, I know we got to wrap up here just briefly. Let's just touch communication real quick, because it really changes the way we communicate too.
Right. Yeah. So communication is much more open and transparent, because in a 2.0 framework, the communication that you use is to give them what they need to simply do the job. In 4.0, you share your motivation, you share your thought, you share really the totality of what's going on, and it creates that environment for people to self-organize, develop the teams, develop the solutions to solve the issue, or to come up with a new process, a new system, to empower the organization to move it forward. So it's really about trusting your people. It's about control and trust.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think almost in the 2.0, information is almost a recipe for chaos versus
Yeah,
in the 4.0, information is critical to empower people. And without it, you're handcuffing them to not make good decisions and to
exactly.
not be able to self-lead.
No, that's exactly it. You have, and it just becomes I'm better than you because I know more than you at a 2.0 level. But you're right, at a 4.0 level, if you don't give them all of the information, then you're not going to get the solution that's best for the company. You're going to get something odd, or something that doesn't make sense. Now, if you're a 2.0 leader in a 4.0 organization, you may want that because it may be a way of getting rid of people. It becomes a manipulation, unfortunately. But in a healthy organization with 4.0 leadership, you would never withhold information unless you just didn't have it.
Right. And contributing to your point, it's really equality, that there's this hierarchical, I know, you don't.
Right.
Trust me, I have the information, you don't have that. If you knew, you could probably make the same decision.
Yep.
I'm not so sure that I would.
Right.
So in that 4.0, there's really a lot of equality that we're going to share the information. I don't know if you have time to answer this, but
Yep.
I think a big question sometimes that leaders struggle with is really this question around transparency and how transparent do I be? And that sometimes it seems like if for a leader to be transparent, they're supposed to be completely naked, so to speak, with everything. And I don't think that's always what it's talking about. Speak a little bit more about how you see transparency versus that leader who's like, yeah, I'm so stressed out, my family's a mess, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, what are we doing? That is not the transparency we're talking about.
Right.
How does a leader be transparent? What is it talking about?
So you open up and share with them your motivation, your thoughts, your own decision-making processes, that go about leading in that moment, and you share with them everything that they need to do to get the job done. This is not you sharing about your partner's drug addiction and things like that. That's not the kind of transparency we're talking about. We're talking about giving everybody the information that's needed to get the job done. And just as an example, let's say that I told you I was really tired, and if you knew what I had to go through, what I had done all day, you would understand why I'm tired. Okay, so that's an example of data. That's a data point. I am tired. It's a fact. I am tired. But if I told you I'm tired because I stayed up till 1 a.m. last night doing some research on XYZ topic, and my 6-year-old was scared because of the storms, that's information. So we give information, not data. And when you give information, then you create the environment for people to understand what's going on, and then to be able to create processes, systems, solutions, innovations. And so what we really want to do is communicate information, not simply data, not simply facts.
That's right. Yeah, and I think maybe as you were saying that, I think sometimes facts and data is done to do. You need this information so that you can execute.
Right.
Versus information is given for context and understanding.
Yep.
And so if it gives context and understanding, it's information. If it's simply, again, going back to transactional, it's data and facts that really isn't information.
Right. No, it's just, I don't know what it is. Data is the best term I can come up with, but it's not information.
Yeah, it almost feels a little 3.0, like this attempt to try to be more transparent. So I'm going to share with you that I'm tired. So
Yeah.
I'm sharing a personal fact that I'm tired, but now it almost sounds like an excuse and whatever, because people take that 10 different ways versus why are you sharing that with me?
Right.
Like versus giving the framework of it so that people have information to understand and empowers them to move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, there are so many more aspects to 2 and 4.0 leadership, but certainly it affects the way that we lead in our processes and in our organizations, the decisions we make, the way we communicate. But when we're coming from this 2.0 data, top-down, control, task-driven, transactional, we're going to find ourselves in one lens. When we can shift over to be more collaborative, relational, team, dynamic, organic, we find ourselves in another lens in another world. So
Right.
I think we'll continue to explore that upcoming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll spend some time in that, and that'll get fun. It really will. I think anyway. So.
Well, I hope this episode has helped some of our listeners as they're thinking about 2.0, 4.0. Honestly, I think we all have an opportunity to reflect. I know there's ways that I show up 2.0 as a parent, as a leader, as a coach, and it's just an opportunity to go, where am I 2? Where am I 4? What do I need to shift?
Absolutely, absolutely, and so as we talk about this in the future, then make sure you download future episodes where we talk about this, and then put some steps in, and maybe we'll actually do an episode on this. We kind of take some time to talk about how we explore our own 2.0 leanings, and maybe move to 4.0, and how just self-evaluation.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
All right. Well, listen, it's continue to subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll talk to you again.
All right. Take care. Have a good
Take
one.
care. You too.